Hello and welcome to this session for the Edinburgh TV Festival. I am Newsnight's Katie Razzle and I'll be speaking to two of the country's most prominent news presenters about covering the most significant and challenging story in generations, about how they balanced informing the public and holding the government to account. But first, here's a reminder of how we got here.
And again, you're watching Kay Burley at breakfast. 80 people now known to have died from the coronavirus in China.
The most likely place that we may find a case is someone who's in the country already.
So we'll return to Brexit shortly, but now to the coronavirus. Today, the first UK cases of the virus were confirmed.
The advice for anyone who is worried is to regularly and thoroughly wash your hands.
Some people call him the super spreader.
Health experts have warned that the chances of containing it are diminishing.
I'm pretty worried, but it's my job to be worried.
Contain, delay, research and mitigate.
There's been a bit of confusing advice about things like shaking hands.
I was at a hospital the other night where I think there were actually a few coronavirus patients, and I shook hands with everybody.
Realistically, what's the earliest we will see a vaccine?
We'd be very lucky to get one within a year.
There were 3 cases identified in Italy 2 weeks ago. Yesterday there were over 3,000.
From this evening, I must give the British people a very simple instruction. You must stay at home.
Can you work out why the government didn't do this earlier?
I was tested and that test has been positive.
I've developed mild symptoms of the coronavirus, that's to say a temperature and a persistent cough.
Prime Minister Boris Johnson is tonight in intensive care.
This is a precaution should he require ventilation.
The UK has now recorded the most deaths in Europe and is the second worst hit country in the world.
Why did you not stay on your primary residence, Mr Cummings, as the government guidelines state?
As far as I can see, he stuck to the rules.
Well, we asked the government to come on this evening. They told us, do join in at home if you know the words. No one was available.
What's the government advice if you're struggling with COVID-19 and it's affected your eyesight?
I'm sorry, Kay, I didn't hear that question.
Good afternoon. Thank you for coming.
You take their advice and you make the policy. You can't stick this on the scientists.
Well, I can.
From Saturday the 4th of July, you can have dinner out, have a drink in a pub, go on a staycation, get your hair cut.
Do I need to wear a mask or not?
It won't be compulsory, but we would certainly encourage it.
So the Health Secretary was wrong yesterday.
The UK has fallen into its largest recession on record because of the coronavirus lockdown.
We have probably reached near the limits or the limits of what we can do in terms of opening up society.
I'm joined by Kay Burley, one of the original presenters at Sky News, and next week launching her latest show, The Kay Burley Show, and by Cathy Newman, a presenter on Channel 4 News and also a broadcaster on Times Radio. And let's start with thank you very much for joining me.
Thank you for inviting us.
If you cast your mind back to early January, can you remember when you first heard about coronavirus? Can you remember how quickly you started covering it and what you thought about how you should cover it?
I remember that I was just broadly aware of what was going on in China. And when it really crystallised for me that this was a really big deal was I was in Davos covering the Economic Forum, and I did an interview with a guy called Richard Hatchett, who's a sort of vaccines expert and has done quite a few interviews with us since. And he said it was the scariest thing, I'm paraphrasing, but the scariest thing he'd seen in his career. And I kind of thought, wow, that's quite significant. And that was end of January. And after that, I really kept a very close eye on the story, and I just saw it sort of snowball from there, no pun intended.
We were presenting the show from Westminster. We're the only breakfast show that's in Westminster, so we get a lot of politicians. Brexit was the end of January, so that was a very big deal, and we'd also just got a new government in place the week before Christmas, and the House had risen shortly after that. So it wasn't really that big a deal. Of course it was. We had Matt Hancock, a series of other government ministers on subsequently, all suggesting that they knew at the time in January that it was a big deal. None of them was saying it to us live on television at that stage.
And I remember at that time there was a discussion in the office, and because I'd had this interview in Davos, I was sort of saying, oh God, this it's now in the country, this is going to spread. And I remember in the office, a lot of people were saying, well, actually, they've damped this down pretty well, and not this could be the end of it, but there was a sort of belief at that point that actually the government and the health authorities were doing okay.
And what, was that, were you agreeing with that? I mean, was that a feeling, obviously in hindsight, people were saying we should have locked down earlier, all of that, and indeed it was being questioned, I think at the time, on many programmes by then, should we be locking down when we were seeing what was happening in other countries. I remember on Newsnight, someone from Sage coming on and saying, we're 2 weeks behind Italy.
That was quite a bit later,
and that was a
wasn't
lot
it?
later, but that was a moment where you thought, my goodness.
We believed the government, and it was something that we didn't know about. We, at the time, initially we thought it was a bad case of the flu. I remember ringing my GP and saying, I've had a flu vaccine, so that mean I'll be okay? And he said, no, it doesn't. And I thought, oh, okay, it's not the flu. And the government wasn't taking it that seriously. Then we had what happened at Cheltenham, and 250,000 people were allowed to mingle together. And then on the 23rd of March, the Prime Minister made that announcement on the Monday night saying, that's it, we're all going to have to lock down. They did a brilliant job to start with. They said, if you stay at home, you will live. If you go out, you will die.
Terrifying.
Yeah, great message at the time for people who were vulnerable, but it took them a long time, once lockdown was eased, to convince those people that were staying at home that it was okay, probably, to go out again.
Arguably, they haven't done it yet.
I think by the time
you were
of Cheltenham,
presenting that
though,
night, though, weren't you?
Yes.
I remember seeing you. And
Yeah.
I remember watching it at home. I felt like it was one of those moments where everybody didn't remember where they were when you saw that statement from the Prime Minister. You did look quite shocked.
It felt like a sort of wartime moment. It did, I mean, a lot of people have said we're fighting a war against the virus, and I don't think that's an exaggeration to say that that night, I went home from work and the streets were completely empty. It was really quite sobering. I sort of send shivers down my spine now just thinking about doing that. We cut live to the Prime Minister's broadcast to the nation, and I remember just, it renders you speechless actually just thinking of the moment and the severity of that moment and the enormity of what was ahead. But I think it was interesting what Kay was saying. You believed the government. We all wanted to believe the government, but I think it fairly soon became apparent. It was a matter of weeks, really, that things were unravelling.
I think you have to accept that politicians are reasonable people, and they go into politics to try to make a difference. And the choices that they make mean that people will live or die. And they have had to accept that responsibility going forward. As a result, did they make the right decision about lockdown? Did they make the right decision about care homes? Did they make the right decision about PPE? Did they make the right decision about quarantining? Again, hindsight is a wonderful thing, but they will have to answer, I'm guessing with a judicial inquiry, for the 60,000 plus deaths that we have seen in the United Kingdom, one of the highest in the whole world. And that was as a direct result of the decisions that the Prime Minister and his cabinet and Cobra were making at the time.
But did you feel more willing to give the government the benefit of the doubt early on?
I think that the British public was. And I think that if we went against what the fear that we've talked about earlier, that the British public was feeling, then if you weren't in step with the government, then you were being in some way unpatriotic.
I think initially there was definitely that sense that this was a really desperate situation for our country and the world, and it was, yeah. And I think that, there was a sense that we had to be respectful in our questioning, as we always would be, and that the public did give the government the benefit of the doubt. You saw that in the polling evidence.
Duty to inform them about social distancing, about closure of public spaces.
And a duty to scrutinise too, because I take your point completely about the judicial inquiry, the public inquiry that's to come. But I also think that we can't afford to wait that long. We as journalists, and I know you do this all the time every day, you've got to hold the government to account, because there'll be a second wave. If we're not in the second wave already, maybe the first wave never ended. We have a duty to scrutinise what's happening right now.
Early on, there was a debate about that, wasn't there? The likes of Alan Sugar saying, we've all got to pull together. This isn't a time for, accountability in that sense and scrutiny. It's
always barroom broadcasters, though, aren't there? There are always people that think that we are not doing our job properly. I am a journalist who asks questions that my audience want to know the answer to. I keep my questions simple, I try and keep them to less than 8 words. Then politicians can't wriggle off the hook. And if they don't answer the question, I keep asking the question for the 10 or 15 minutes that I've got that cabinet minister in the morning, and holding them to account on behalf of my viewers at home who were probably shouting those questions at the telly. I think that in the early days, people, as I said, were fearful and just wanted information. But then they became frustrated that they weren't necessarily always getting the information that they needed. And sometimes it was conflicting information. And I think Barnard Castle, which I'm sure we'll go on to, was a deal breaker for the government.
Yeah. Well, that's what I was going to ask you. Was there a moment that
Sorry.
you thought... No, that's great. I mean, we've got to it, which is that moment that turned it, where really you felt a shift. It became clear, I suppose, that the government was an outlier, the UK was an outlier in terms of policy and doing badly on most international comparisons. Was there a moment?
I think the care home deaths were, which, you know, the scale became apparent before Barnard Castle, didn't it? I mean, the timeline in my head is...
But it was something that we became aware of more slowly, whereas Barnard Castle, when we saw the images on the front page of the Daily Mirror and other broadcasts, I think the Guardian had it as well, didn't they, to show that he had actually been to Barnard Castle while he had COVID. We're talking about Cummings, of course, Dominic Cummings and his family, and it just, people felt that they had been told to stay at home for this length of time, and they had not seen their families, they'd not been at the graveside when their loved ones had been buried. They'd missed birthdays, they'd missed all sorts of family get-togethers, and then this man, they felt, was breaking and flouting all the rules. And then people like Michael Gove were saying to me, it's okay to test your eyesight by strapping your 4-year-old in the back of the car and driving 20 miles to Barnard Castle.
It was a great interview.
That's when it was the turning point.
I agree with you, that was definitely a turning point, but I think the sort of scales had fallen from people's eyes before that about the way the government handled the crisis, because it had become apparent, and okay, there is dispute about the figures which set to use, but it had become apparent that Britain was one of the worst hit countries.
By any measure, it's a disgrace.
Yeah, I mean, then you've got to say, well, where do you apportion blame? Is that something inherent? You know, is it about obesity, or is there a failure of government strategy here that has meant that we have been hardest hit? And I think the investigations we did into care homes and the scale of failure in sending people infected from hospital to care homes without testing them, I think that as that started to emerge, I think a public anger was building.
Let's, you know, hit it head on in terms of accountability. You know, you on Sky, across the board, but your show, you get a lot of access to ministers, cabinet ministers, senior government figures, Channel 4 News less so. How, well, I suppose with you first, you know, how do you scrutinise and hold the government to account if you're not getting access to the people in charge?
Well, it is difficult. You know, our duty as public service broadcasters is to calmly inform the public, to scrutinise what's going on in government and to set out the facts. We do that through our investigations on PPE, for example, and the expiry of the ventilators, the care homes investigations I've already mentioned. But you do also need to speak to the people in power and hold them to account. And, you know, we have had a handful of interviews with cabinet ministers. We've had interviews with other ministers, but not nearly as many as we'd like. And I think the press conference situation with Zoom questions became very frustrating, because it looked like the government were being accountable, but actually, you know, they could actually cut people off without having follow-up questions, and it became a very frustrating business trying to hold the government to account that way. You also wouldn't get a question every day. You know, you had to bid for your questions. And I do feel that with such a national crisis, that risk, you know, the government looking petulant, really, not giving that access, or something even worse. I mean, you know, the accountability was not there when the country needed it most.
Well, I think it was, as far as Sky News viewers were concerned, of course, and I think that's reflected in the latest Ofcom report, which says that of all the British broadcasters, we are highest quality, most trustworthy, most accurate and most impartial. But I feel for my colleagues at the BBC and also at Channel 4 who don't necessarily have the opportunity to hold those high-ranking politicians to account every day. But I also think that it doesn't necessarily always need to be a senior cabinet minister or a senior politician. There are lots of other people that that you've questioned. You know, I've seen you question nightly, where we've got a senior scientist or exactly virologist, whoever it might be, Andy Burnham, who's the Greater Manchester Mayor, etc., etc. There are lots of other people that are fragments in the jigsaw that also tell the story.
But the failure of accountability, when you look at our viewing figures, which soared, all broadcasters did, but I mean, just to take ours, at one point in the pandemic, it was 2 million a night. The government was, I believe, risked failing in its duty to inform those people by refusing to put ministers up on a regular basis. We have got interviews with ministers, but I would like more to be able to inform, the millions of people that were tuning in during this national crisis.
Did it feel different for you, though, Kay, that you were getting access to top-level people, but asking them about how well or badly they were saving lives in the UK? Did that feel like a slightly different interview than you've done previously with Prime Ministers or whoever else, where you might be talking about, I don't know, policies of some kind that, yes, of course, affect people's lives, but not as dramatically as...
No, I always, when I interview a politician, I always prepare my questions with my audience in mind. You were talking about audience figures. As far as the pandemic was concerned, our audience figures in the morning trebled in the week at the start of the pandemic, and we had 10 million a day across all platforms during the course of 2020. So I know that there's a lot of people at home who are watching and are saying to us, come on, you need to nail him on this. My mother is in a care home and she is surrounded by people who have coronavirus. I can't go and see her. She might die. I won't be able to go to the funeral. So I felt very passionate about it, both as a broadcaster, but also as a mother. And also I've had, sadly, friends and loved ones who have perished as a result and succumbed to coronavirus. So I did feel very emotional about it, but also I tried to keep that emotion out, leave it at the door, check it at the door, because I needed to nail politicians, and I see that as my job.
Do you think, you mentioned the press conferences earlier, they began with journalists asking questions, it then changed and the public was brought in. Did that, in a sense, sort of, I don't know, signal a change in the media's role, certainly in terms of how the government viewed the media's role?
Yeah, I mean, it just felt like a dilution of the kind of, when I was a lobby journalist, you would be able to have, there was a sort of period where you'd be able to do close questioning of the government's official spokesman or spokeswoman, and they would know exactly what was in the Prime Minister's mind. This was under Tony Blair all those years ago. And you felt that you came out that lobby briefing better informed and you had information to impart to your viewers. These Zoom press conferences were frustrating. They went on and on because there would be questions from all and sundry, and yet there wouldn't be follow-up, so you wouldn't get to ask you wouldn't get that sort of close scrutiny. And it was just an incredibly frustrating business, and it did feel like a dilution of accountability.
I would say, to answer your point specifically, I think it's fine that members of the public can ask a question of the Prime Minister, and why not? He's directly elected, or certainly
I agree with that.
His MPs
but
are directly elected.
But
I have no problem with that happening. I suppose. I don't know what's going to happen as far as the daily news briefings are concerned that we're looking to start after. All very American, and it's not necessarily going to be a government minister every day or the Prime Minister every day. And of course at Sky News we've got 24/7 air to fill, so we will cover those on merit, but we are not saying that we will automatically carry that news conference every day, whether at 4 o'clock or 11 o'clock or whenever it might be. We will still be looking for those ministers to be held to account in a much more robust fashion as well.
But does the suggestion that that's going to happen offer up some insights into how the government sees the relationship with the media going forward?
It's a two-way street. If they want to have that broadcast, they need broadcasters to be on board.
And also, just to clarify, I think it's great that the public can ask a question of ministers, the Prime Minister, brilliant, but there's a forum for that. And, these were supposed to be press conferences where the press got a chance to, clues in the title, the press got a chance to ask.
See, I would call them news conferences, and I think that, we have to disagree
I'm an old
on this.
Journalist.
Yeah, well, so am I. So I would call them a news conference, and I have no problem with members of the public holding politicians to account as well, but also there is room for both, I would say.
So did we hold Chris Whitty, Patrick Vance, did we hold them to account in the same way as we did the politicians? Did we not need to do that? Was that not our role?
I'd love a few more interviews with them.
So would I.
But you've been asking, and
well, we do get the experts on. I can't remember. I've probably interviewed Chris Whitty. I've interviewed a lot of people. I haven't interviewed him specifically during this pandemic. I would love to, if he's watching. Chris, anytime, loads of time on the telly box for you, whenever you fancy it.
And what about that following the science? That's something we've heard a lot about. You've talked to certainly one minister about following the science, I'm sure more. But that phrase, we're following the science, became a bit of a mantra through this. And yet, as you're saying, science is not one view. Yet following the science became, well, what did it become?
It evaporated. In the end, it was politics that took over, as it was always going to. I mean, they're informed by the scientists, of course, but at the end of the day, these incredibly difficult life or death decisions, and I accept what Kay's saying, these are, you don't envy the politicians making these decisions, but in the end, the politicians have to make the decisions informed by the science, but I think they're no longer led by the scientists. They've taken back control, to coin a phrase.
Yeah, that was a turning point for Therese Coffey, actually, on my programme, when she said the scientists might have got it wrong. So she was basically throwing them under the bus. Was she right to do that? Don't know. We'll have to wait and see. But I still think we are tiptoeing through the raindrops when it comes to COVID-19. We don't really know at this stage. Of course, we're going to hold people's feet to the flame, but we don't know. We don't know if there's going to be a second wave, do we? We don't know where that's going to leave us. We don't know whether there's going to be another lockdown. We don't know what that's going to mean as far as the economy of the country is concerned. We're not talked about economists, but don't know.
We know more than we did.
Yeah, we're sitting here being barroom experts. Yeah. We just don't know.
And what have the media got right? What have the media got wrong?
Oh. Have we got another half hour?
We're nearly there.
Yeah, what have we got right and what have we got wrong?
I think we've informed.
Sorry, exactly. I was exactly what I was going to say. We've done our best, our level best, under fire on occasion when the country was terrified to go out, and all they wanted to do was listen to every single word and take as gospel what the government was saying. We held those politicians to account. So we got that right. What did we get wrong?
Well, I mean, just what we got right, agree completely on informing, and I do feel really proud that people have placed their trust in public service broadcasting at a time when, I think people are realising that what they see on social media is not the whole story, and so I feel proud that public service broadcasting has risen to the challenge. What have we got wrong? I mean, I remember, I'll be honest, an early interview I did with the Health Minister, Helen Whately, and I was sort of quite angry about what was going on, and I was pretty robust with her. I didn't think she was as briefed up as she should have been, and I think at that moment I probably misjudged the tone there. It was a very hard balance to strike between the audience, people wanting to trust the government, as we've discussed, and trying to scrutinise the government and hold the government to account. And I think at that particular point I hadn't responded to that. So it's just treading that balance. What else have we got wrong?
I'm sure there's, if members of the public or our audience were sitting around the table, they would have a whole list of things. We don't go to work thinking we're going to get that wrong. We go to work to try and inform and educate as best we can.
Is it been a very hard story to cover? It does take a toll on everybody covering this story, I think. I just wondered, in personal terms, how do you have people you turn to for advice? Have you needed help to cope with this in any way?
Well, I've got to say, you do have an emotional response as a journalist, as anyone else. I remember once just about to do the headlines, and I hadn't actually seen these pictures that had just come in until we did the headline rehearsal, and it was that awful picture of the 13-year-old boy's coffin being lowered into the ground by people in hazmat suits. And I remember just feeling myself starting to well up, because I just, you have a son, I've got children as well, and I just remember having a very emotional connection to that story. And obviously, I think you do leave your emotion at the door, but I think you also have a human and humane response to the scale of what we're reporting, and I think you need to do that as a journalist too.
And that was the image, actually, that Matt Hancock said that he'd seen on TV, and as a result he changed the rules so that people could actually be at the graveside when they were burying their loved ones. So I suppose, when you were asking earlier about the difference that broadcasting can make, I think that actually, politicians do have a heart. They do watch the news at night and throughout the day, as most other people in the country do, and as a result, it can make a difference.
And it has felt like a very important time to be a journalist, while at the same time, advertising revenues falling, audience figures way up, but for all sorts of issues, there are cuts, there are advertising revenues falling. It's a sort of weird, strange time. What is the future, do you think?
This is a terrible pandemic that we're in the middle of, but this too will pass, and there will be a brighter future, and we have to bear that in mind.
I agree with that, and whether we're in a V-shaped recovery or a U-shaped recovery, the next few months will tell, and it is obviously very stressful. I feel that quality investigative journalism is at existential risk. We've seen BuzzFeed UK close. I feel terrible for all the journalists whose jobs are at stake, and I feel it is a very anxious time, but I also feel it's a very positive time to be a journalist, because public service broadcasting has never been more important than now, and so the trust that our viewers are placing in us is what gets us out of bed in the morning and gets you through the day, and it's incredibly important.
Thank you so much, Cathy Newman. Thank you, Kay Burley.
You're
Thank
welcome.
you to the Edinburgh TV Festival and our sponsors, Virgin Media. Thank you for watching.